But I went down to the school and interviewed him and filmed him. It may have been the nets, or someone might have just been bowling to him. The thing that struck me is he had, for one so young, 15, he did have a real steely focus. I suppose it probably had a deep effect. Of course, you're losing your mother at an early age is going to have a deep effect on you. So I suppose I probably went off the rails a little bit, if anything.
And obviously, you touched on it a little bit earlier, Damian, about your coverage of Hillsborough. Obviously, there might be people who are watching this who maybe weren't alive at that point, but they've heard the stories. Could you just give us a little bit of an indication of what you did there, some of the things you saw, and how it maybe impacted you as an individual?
You don't seem that happy that you've won.
More than you believe. More than you believe, I'm happy.
You aren't showing it.
I'm so happy, believe me. I'm so happy. Happy New Year.
Yeah, I guess we'll start with the big question, Damian, as I'm sure everybody wants to know. Why on earth are you a Hull City fan?
I was traumatised from a very early age, probably like most football fans, by my dad, who had moved to Hull in the 1960s, and me and my two older brothers, because he was a big football fan, were dragged to watch Hull City. And we actually saw them through quite a good era to start with. This was like the 1960s, middle to late 60s I started going, 1967, 68. So I'd be about 5 or 6. And it was a good era. They'd been promoted from the old third division to the second division, which is now the Championship. And they had a really good side, really strong side who challenged for promotion for probably 4 or 5 seasons before they tailed off, and then became pretty mediocre after that for quite a spell.
So was it growing up with Hull City, did that sort of fuel your passion for football?
Yeah, I suppose in tandem with playing at school as well. My heroes growing up weren't the obvious ones, the sort of the George Bests, and I was a big fan of Pele. I suppose everybody was, but growing up, it wasn't the big stars of the day. It was the Hull City players that I looked up to, the people like Ken Wagstaff and Chris Chilton, who older listeners may remember. All men in the 70s now. I've got to know a little bit as they've got older as well, but they were my heroes. So it was playing football and it was watching Hull City in tandem, really, that sort of fired my interest in football.
And with Hull City, to be honest, Damian, obviously over the past sort of 10 years, there's been some really big highs and some really big lows. Obviously from when you were a youngster, can you sort of give us, an indication and sort of an understanding of the best moments you've seen as a Hull City fan and just figments that stand out?
Well, from the start of my career, the best moment was probably we got to the quarterfinals of the FA Cup and played Stoke City at home. This was 1971. And Ken Wagstaff, who I've already mentioned, got a couple of goals. So we were 2-0 up. We were in what is now the Championship, Division 2. And Stoke were a pretty good team in the First Division, now the Premier League. And we were 2-0 up at home. And Ken Wagstaff, for one of his goals, actually sat Gordon Banks on his backside and just slotted the ball past him. And we thought we were on the way to the semi-finals of the FA Cup. Unheard of as a Hull City fan. They came back and won 3-2. So that was an early, I suppose, glimpse into the how football can kick you in the teeth, I suppose. And then more recently, 2008, promotion to the Premier League, unforgettable afternoon. Local boy done good, Dean Windass with a volley to beat Bristol City and get to the Premier League. Never ever imagined in my lifetime. Never ever imagined I'd see them in the Premier League. But that was just a glorious afternoon. Grown men in tears, including me. And I think at the time we didn't really care whether we survived in the Premier League or not. It was just getting there. That was the big prize. And that is still my golden memory of being a Hull City fan.
And when you were younger, was there sort of, because obviously you've been a sports correspondent for many outlets, has it always been football that's sort of been the drive for you, or has it been other sports? Did you play other sports when you were younger? Were you interested in any other sports?
I played rugby till I was into my 30s, actually. Rugby union. I've always followed rugby league. I've always been interested in things like boxing, athletics, but football. You know how football is. It's all embracing. It's everywhere, isn't it? I suppose I probably subconsciously or maybe even consciously thought I want to be part of that. I want to be part of this thing that is the world game that sort of dominates a lot of people's thoughts day in, day out. And I thought I saw a way in for myself.
How have you, when you've obviously started following the sport, Damian, or sports, how have you seen, I guess, football in particular change over the years?
It's unrecognisable. From when I first went and stood on the terraces, and there were terraces back then, it was dangerous, it was violent, it was aggressive. To now, some people say it's too sanitised, but I think, although I sort of look back on the old days with fond memories, as unpleasant as they were at times, the modern game is unrecognisable for it in terms of the quality of the pitches, the quality of the stadiums, the fitness and skills of the athletes, and just the whole match day experience. I mean, I still sometimes marvel when I go to the loo at half time and wash my hands in hot water, having used the loo. Because in the old days, it was you went to the toilet up against a wall in a shed. There was no hot and cold water. There might have been cold water. There was certainly no soap. It was just really, really primitive. And that's just a small sort of snapshot that I always quote as to how the game has changed beyond all recognition in the time I've been following it.
And what is it like growing up as a young individual on the terraces, watching Hull City? What was that experience like? You talk about it being sort of violent and quite aggressive. So can you give us a picture of what it was like at Hull for a young lad like yourself?
And at the time, you never really questioned. You just kind of accepted that this is the nature of football. It is brutal and primitive in many ways. So it was hard. Yeah, I mean, it was. Certain clubs had a reputation when they came to Boothby Park to play. It's the obvious clubs, the sort of Millwalls and the Leeds United, who had a reputation, rightly or wrongly, for having a hooligan element. And at the time in the 70s, when I was probably just coming into teenage years, the worst were Manchester United, believe it or not. So a visit from Manchester United when they got relegated to Division 2 in the mid-70s, A, was a big game. B, they were going to bring thousands of fans because they had a huge following. Some of them were a hooligan element, and C, it might be dangerous. So it's the only time I can remember as a kid my dad insisting that we didn't stand on the terraces. We went in the stand and sat down because that was a safer area for a young lad to be. And I can't recall whether there was any trouble when we played Manchester United at Boothby Park in the 70s. There may well have been. My memory can play tricks, but I won't even go there. But my biggest memory is that we won the game 2-0, and Ken Wagstaff got on the score sheet again. And again, dreamland. We're beating Manchester United, who not long before had won the European Cup and had all these star names, and yeah, little old Hull had done it.
Boothby Park or the KC?
Boothby Park has so many memories, and it's easy to look back with rose-tinted specs. But at the end, it was a bit of a dump. I mean, I think even most ardent fans would accept it. It'd been neglected for years. It was falling apart. A lot of people say it was rather soulless ground anyway. And I kind of get that. If I look back at my favourite grounds, putting aside my obvious kind of affinity to Hull, I wouldn't say it's one of my favourite grounds to watch football in. But it holds all those memories of going to the match with my brothers and with my dad. And you can't really take those away. And so I will always look back with rose-tinted spectacles, and I will just forget all the stuff about the fact that the toilets were terrible, it was dangerous, and the ground was falling apart. It was our home at the time. KCOM Stadium is a fine example of a modern stadium. When it's full, it's bouncing. There's a great atmosphere there. The pitch is fantastic, and it's starting to create its own memories. I know there's some unhappy times with the owners now, but in terms of what we've achieved in the time we've been there, it's made memories for us already, even though we've only been in the ground for less than 20 years. So yeah, with my rose-tinted spectacles on, I'd say Boothbury Park, but with my realistic head on, I'd say it's got to be the Cake On.
So if we revert back a little bit there, just to your school, like you were just talking about your father and your family there, Damian. Have you always had sort of a supportive family network throughout your, you know, supporting your passions?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think my mum died at an early age, so it was my dad who sort of fostered my interest in sport. And he like I think most parents, he wanted me to try a bit of everything. So I did try my hand at most sports because academically I was okay, but I wasn't really that committed. So I had to go at everything, and he supported it. He came to watch me playing football and rugby and things like that. I was never particularly outstanding at those, but I would say I had decent support from my family, and it sort of stood me in good stead, I think.
Was it if you don't mind me asking, Damian, with the passing of your mother, did that give you sort of a drive or a motivation, or did it impact you in any sort of like emotional ways? Did your father have to give you extra support because of that?
I think at the time, I suppose it probably had a deep effect. Of course, you're losing your mother at an early age is going to have a deep effect on you. So I suppose I probably went off the rails a little bit, if anything. Became a little bit badly behaved at school. I was probably kind of acting out some of the issues I was trying to process. So I wasn't good at school for a few years, I guess, after that. I suppose the penny dropped eventually, and I realised that I was never going to make a living out of being a professional sportsman. So I had to knuckle down to academic work, and I did in the end, and went through the traditional academic route of GCSEs and A levels and university and all the rest of it. So yeah, it had an effect. It's bound to. But I was supported, I think, well enough through the whole thing.
And just moving on to broadcasting as well. When did that passion ignite? When did you think to yourself, you know what, I'm going to give this a go?
I guess, excuse me. I guess when I finished university, I'd always written. I'd written for the school magazine and things like that. Not so much about sport, actually, more about music. I was really into sort of bands and going to see live bands. I used to write sort of gig reviews and things. And in the back of my mind, quite fancied myself as being some kind of music writer. Then I went to university and played sport at university. And at the end of it, didn't know what I was going to do. So I had a look around and saw what kind of career options there were for someone like me with a pretty bang average degree. And I came back to the idea of journalism and looked at some postgraduate courses that were out there at the time, which were few and far between in actual fact. There were only about 10, 12 of them up and down the country. So I knew the odds were going to be stacked against me because I knew that this is sort of fabled as a glamorous career. So I knew I was going to be up against it trying to get onto one of these courses, but I applied to all of them. At the time, there still is a big one at Cardiff University, London City University, London College of Printing, which is probably called something else now. All over the country, there were, as I say, about 12 of them, I think. And I went for a couple of interviews, one at Cardiff, which I didn't do very well in. And the next day I travelled up to Preston, to what was then Lancashire Polytechnic. It's now UCLan, University of Central Lancashire. And I put everything in my efforts to get on that course. I really sort of went the extra mile because I really wanted to go there. And fortunately enough, I got selected. And I knew at the time that was my ticket into some kind of career in what I do now. At the time, my ambitions were to be a news reporter, really, and I was a news reporter for about 10 years in local radio and regional telly, always with a hankering after sport. And having got that basic grounding from that postgraduate course, it opened doors to working in local radio and, well, initially going on attachments to local radio and then being offered freelance work and then being offered a job in local radio. So I was up and running on the back of getting a place on that course, and that was the key for me, getting on the course.
So why sports over music then?
The sort of music press died a death. There used to be half a dozen sort of regular weekly music papers, which I read at the time. New Musical Express, Sounds, Melody Maker, just to name three there. But as newspapers have gone downhill, the music press, the press side of it has gone downhill. There's still an online presence for some of those publications, but so basically, and at the same time, sport was taking off. Football particularly was taking off. The Premier League had started when I decided to focus on football, and we'd had Gazza's tears at the World Cup in 1990, and suddenly football was everywhere. And that was when, I suppose, again, consciously or subconsciously, I realised that there's opportunity and an opening for me. And a job came up with the BBC, focusing solely on sport. I was working for the BBC doing news at the time. And this was about 93, 94. And that's when I sort of went, head first into it.
And you obviously started Radio Hallam in Sheffield. What was that like?
It was great. It was great fun. We were all kind of young and a bit naive and sort of determined to do well in the business. They had a really good newsroom. You think of commercial radio now, and a lot of it's music orientated, and that's all. Back then, it used to have a fully staffed newsroom. All the independent radio stations had a fully staffed newsroom, and they took news seriously. And I was news then. I dabbled in sport, as I say, but I was essentially a news reporter, bulletin reader. Used to write scripts. Used to go out and interview people, and it would be the whole range of sort of news stories, everything from sort of rows in the local councils to post office robberies to murders to. And I suppose the pinnacle of it would have been the Hillsborough disaster in terms of a major event that I covered. So it was a fantastic grounding to go on and do anything really in broadcasting. I presented a couple of shows. I read bulletins. And I kind of just honed my skills, I suppose. You put it like that in a quite a sort of rough and tough news environment where you had to respond quickly. You had to be on your toes, and I would be one of the youngest in the office. I would be the youngest in the office when I started. So surrounded by experienced people, good operators who knew their trade, and you got opportunities. And we were determined really to sort of take on the BBC. Radio Sheffield had a fully stocked newsroom, big news operation, and it's kind of dominated, I suppose, the local news or broadcast news scene. So we were the opposition and the sort of Johnny-come-latelys, if you like. So we would gauge ourselves against how Radio Sheffield did, and we would try to be a bit more, I suppose, popular, tabloid to their sort of broadsheet, if you like.
Would you say the newsroom has changed from when you first started to now?
Yeah, I think it was probably a bit more hard-bitten back then. Some people might call it bullying, I suppose, but it was certainly a bit more sort of hard-bitten and cynical, where it's a bit more, I think people behave a bit better now. I think there's a lot more awareness of treating people properly, whereas in the old days, not so much at Radio Hallam, because Radio Hallam was quite a relaxed place, actually, but certainly commercial radio newsrooms, from talking to other people back then, were quite hard-bitten, cynical. It was all about guessing the story. And that was it. And there was no thought to people's feelings and their mental health, for example, and whether they were being bullied or put upon. It was a rough, tough environment. But if you can survive it, you can survive anything, really.
Yeah. And do you think you growing up in that environment where it was sort of bullish and maybe there wasn't a consideration for other people's maybe feelings, do you think that gave you sort of a different sort of arrow to your bow, in a sense of being able to gather news stories and be able to hunt down a story?
Yeah, possibly. I think you do have to be a little bit relentless. And people perhaps who know me would say I'm not relentless enough. I'm too soft. But in pursuing a story, you have to be dogged. You have to do things that in the normal run of affairs are not, very pleasant. I mean, I've had to go and knock on doors of people who've been bereaved to ask for interviews or photographs, and it's the worst part of the job. It's, you feel like you're intruding, but equally you have a job to do, and it's how you conduct yourself, I suppose, in situations like that is how you judge whether you've done it right or not. So yeah, there are. People talk about the press get lambasted, particularly now, as being the gutter press or scum or whatever they get, on Twitter. It happens all the time. And I think that it's the basic misunderstanding of what the role is. And the role is to kind of inform people about what's going on. And sometimes that can be a bit messy, can be a bit grubby. It's not very edifying. But I guess it's the price we pay for, our freedom, I suppose, if you want to be a bit pretentious about it. It's people have to do this job. It's part of the democratic process.
And obviously, you touched on it a little bit earlier, Damian, about your coverage of Hillsborough. Obviously, there might be people who are watching this who maybe weren't alive at that point, but they've heard the stories. Could you just give us a little bit of an indication of what you did there, some of the things you saw, and how it maybe impacted you as an individual?
I was actually on a day off. It was a Saturday afternoon, obviously, cup final, semi-final day, and I had actually, ironically, worked on the late shift the night before, and you write an overnight note to the person who's going to take over from you the next day, because the station closed down, or the news side of the operation shuts down at, I think back in the day, about 1 o'clock in the morning. And I wrote a note to the person the next day saying what news was available, what I'd prepared for the day, what things to check, standard kind of practice in a newsroom. And I remember, ironically, I had said, check with the police for a comment on how well the policing has gone at Hillsborough, because it was just a routine thing. There was a cup semi-final in town. There was no local angle for us other than it was a big policing operation, and it would have made a little clip for the bulletin talking to the chief on the day about how they'd managed to manage the situation. So that was an irony given what came later. So as I was on a day off the day afterwards, and I got a call in the afternoon. I was listening on the radio to the story unfolding in the car, and I got a call at home saying, "Come in, it's all hands on deck. This is turning into a major story." So we were in the office at Radio Hallam until probably 2 in the morning, half 1 in the morning, turning around elements of the story, talking to the police, talking to the ambulance, talking to eyewitnesses, people who'd been there, trying to get to the bottom of what happened. Sent people to, reporters were dispatched to the hospital to get information about casualties, to talk to medical staff about the scale of the problems that they're having to deal with, covering the story from all angles, basically. And in terms of putting aside the horror of the day, in terms of a learning curve for how to cover a major story, for me, it was great to watch the news editor dispatching people and rationalising how to cover the story, from what angle, who do we need to talk to, how do we report this element, what are the sensitivities around this part of the story. And it was a real learning exercise for me, just watching, as well as doing some of the reporting and interviewing that I had to do. And to go through it was an invaluable experience, really, in terms of learning about how to cover a story, the sensitivities, how to deal with people in extremis, if you like. And, as I say, for all the horror of the day, I do feel that in terms of my work experience, I took quite a few positives from it.
Was there an added pressure for the people at the top to get it absolutely spot on with regards to reporting?
No, I mean, it's an unfolding story. I mean, you've got your principles of how to behave decently underpinning what you do, but you've also got to get the story. It was just about reporting the story. The horror of what had happened. Questions about why it had happened came later, and that became, a matter of great controversy, obviously. At the time, it was simply reporting the facts. What do we know? What's the view of such and such? What did such and such an eyewitness see? It was the nuts and bolts of gathering a news around a breaking news story. And it was, it was, again, I have to quantify this or qualify it. It was horrific. But for a learning curve for a young journalist, it was useful.
And do you think that helped you sort of, because obviously I can imagine that a lot of it with regards to Hillsborough, yes, you're reporting the facts, but a lot of it's sort of doing things on your feet, you're reacting to things coming in every sort of 15 to 20 minutes. Do you think that helped you reporting on things in the future?
Yeah, I think it gave you a sense of perspective. I mean, people who work in the news business dismiss sport as being the toy department of a broadcasting or a news operation. It's the fun and games, it's the light, frothy stuff. It doesn't matter, sport, ultimately. It's a distraction. So it gave me a sense of perspective, and I've always known that sport is just that. For all its magnificence, we love it. It is only a distraction. It's big business. It's money is involved, careers are involved, but it is games, isn't it? It's PE at the end of the day. So I got a sense of perspective from the Hillsborough disaster, because that was real life. It was real suffering. And it was, it was serious as it gets.
Now, just if we move on a little bit there, when you were younger, you interviewed a 15-year-old Michael Vaughan. I mean, I guess you can't tell greatness from a young age, but I presume you got to see him maybe playing a little bit. I presume, obviously you heard him speak. He's an articulate individual. How was that, and how was seeing his career develop from that moment onwards? Because that must have been a real sort of pivotal moment.
Yeah, it was. I look back on that with very fond memories. It was at Silverdale School in Sheffield, where he was, he'd not even be sort of in his GCSE year. And he was determined to play cricket. And there was a big debate at the time, because you had to be born in Yorkshire to play for Yorkshire. And he was born in Manchester. So I don't know how we identified him as a potential candidate to interview. But I went down to the school and interviewed him and filmed him. It may have been the nets, or someone might have just been bowling to him. And the thing that struck me is he had, for one so young, 15, he did have a real steely focus. And he didn't really play along with the story. The story we wanted was Manchester-born Yorkshireman can't play for Yorkshire. And his position was, I just want to play professional cricket. And I thought that kind of impressed me, really, because he wasn't just playing along for the cameras. He had his own views on it, and he was prepared to express them. But he had a kind of a really steely focus about him. I couldn't have then predicted he was going to go on and be England captain. But I take some very tiny, small satisfaction from the fact that I did that interview with him and he was then successful. But I did actually see him make his first 100 for England, which was against Pakistan at Old Trafford. And I was covering it, I think, for Breakfast News. And he was on in the 90s overnight. And he needed only a handful of runs to make his 100. So we had this idea that we would, I think I'd met his mum, or maybe his mum and dad, on the day that we filmed him as a kid. So I had this idea that we'll take a bottle of champagne and we'll crack it open, him and his mum, and it'll make great pictures for the telly. So I used my BBC expenses to get a bottle of champagne. And we turned up at the ground, and he duly knocked off the runs. We interviewed him afterwards about, I asked him the usual questions about had he slept well the night before and, how it felt and all the rest of it. And then we grabbed his mum and dad. I don't know how we stumbled across them or whether I made contact with them before. But in a stairwell in one of the near the pavilion, we filmed them cracking open this bottle of champagne and toasting their son. So it was kind of the thing had gone full circle from meeting him as a young lad to then celebrating his maiden Test century for England, which was it was really good fun.
Yeah, I can imagine how that'd be like a cracking memory for you. And as well, you you interviewed a young and the first overseas cricketer, Sachin Tendulkar. What were your first thoughts on that, and what was it like to report on that at the time?
Well, I thought how young he was. This would be like 1990, something like that. So I'd be kind of late 20s at the time, and he was 18, 19, and already came with a huge reputation. And it was a big story for Yorkshire to have an overseas cricketer. Again, no one knew he was going to go on to be the legend that he became. But he played pretty well, as I recall. I don't think he set the world on fire, but he had a decent season, culminating in his last game was at Scarborough, again, which we covered. He was quite a shy young lad, really. There was none of the kind of brash sort of cockiness you'd expect from a very top-level cricketer. He seemed quite a modest young lad, but again, he was only 19, and I couldn't claim to know him very well. It was only appearances, really. But it was nice to be the past to be, make headlines all over the world. An amazing, as I say, legendary, probably one of the top, I'm not an expert, but 3, 4, 5, 6 cricketers ever to play the game.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. You moved into television, obviously, after radio, and you covered some huge events. Obviously, the big ones to sort of start with would be, the title wins that you covered with Man City, Man United, Chelsea, Arsenal, Leeds United. What were some of the best memories that you had covering those sort of title wins? Because it must be a really good feel around the area, and there must be some sort of nostalgia that you can take us back to some of those events.
Yeah, I mean, they all kind of blur into the next one, really, because there are so many of them. But I suppose, in terms of drama, I was there the day Manchester City beat QPR to win the title for the first time in the Premier League era, anyway, under Mancini. And that was one of the most extraordinary days I think I've ever seen. Well documented. Everyone, I think, who follows football knows the story of how Aguero scored very, very late on to win the title. But yeah, I mean, I think back, I saw them win it again. I saw Company score that goal against Leicester that just about ensured that they would win it the next Saturday. I saw Sir Alex Ferguson bow out on his last day, holding the trophy in 2013. Yeah, I mean, they all kind of blur into one, but the big ones stand out. The cities, the unbelievable Manchester United sides of the past under Ferguson. I remember John Terry winning it on his last day as Chelsea captain. Privileged to be there. I never lost sight of the fact it was a privilege. Always great fun. I mean, it's a little bit like going to the pub. Everyone's your friend and everyone's in a good mood, and that's what going to a title-winning day is. As long as it goes to plan, everyone's in a good mood. Everyone's happy. The atmosphere is fantastic. It's usually May, so the sun's shining. So they're all kind of unforgettable days, even though they blur a little bit as I look back.
And out of those title-winning teams, who would you say had the best team out of those title winners that you've covered?
Well, that's hard to say. I do think Manchester City have set new standards on occasions during their rise to the top. Football I've never seen before. I've not seen a huge amount of European football, so I'm not perhaps best placed to judge. I've seen World Cup football, and people say European sort of Champions League football is a higher standard than the World Cup anyway. So, but some of the stuff Man City were playing, a season or two ago was just breathtaking. Just a privilege to be there sometimes. It's impossible to answer that question. Is kind of what I'm coming around to. Other days I've seen Thierry Henry in his pomp with Bergkamp and just watched open-mouthed and thought, "Good grief, I'm getting paid to do this." And it was just as I say, it was a privilege. It was a privilege to witness it. and I just think I was just very lucky.
And you've reported for some huge sort of global competitions as well. You've done 3 World Cups, 3 Euros, 6 African Cup of Nations. I sort of remember you mostly from the 2010 South Africa Football World Cup, and I think there was a lot of coverage from you yourself there. What do you think was your favourite competition that you covered, and why?
I've got a bit of a soft spot for the African nations because it's not as big, frankly, as the European Championships or the World Cup. It's a little bit more homely, shall we say. And my old man is African, so I have a bit of a feeling for it anyway. And you get to travel to some places that in the normal run of things you wouldn't go to. I mean, I'm not sure I'm likely to go on holiday to Mali or to Botswana or Angola or somewhere like that. But yeah, I did. My job has taken me there. And it's just so off the beaten track and just so unusual, and the stuff you see. And I remember being in Mali when George Weah was playing for what's his team? Yeah, his team. Who did he play for? George Weah, his national team. I've forgotten off the top of my head. But he's playing for. Sorry, it'll come back to me. But he was playing in the national stadium in Bamako in Mali. And they were trailing 1-0. And I'm close to the perimeter edge. The cameraman, I wasn't allowed sort of pitch side. The cameraman was doing his stuff pitch side, and I was sort of standing back near the running track. Liberia, he played for. So Liberia playing Mali, national stadium in Bamako, full to the rafters, Mali are winning. I'm stood at the edge. And George Weah, I think it was George Weah or someone else equalised late in the game. Or I may have that the other way around. It may be that George Weah had put them ahead and Mali equalised. I forget the details. But anyway, I'm in front of the fans of the team that had scored the goal, this late equaliser. And the place just erupted when the goal went in. And I remember being hit on the head by an old transistor radio from the 1960s. I recognise it because it's the kind of thing my mum had when I was a kid. And this thing was broken anyway. It was just a bit of a radio. And where did they get that? Why did they take it to a football match? What was going on? and I was hurt. It hurt my head. But at the same time, I was laughing my head off at the bizarre notion that I should be hit on the head by half a transistor radio at a football match. So that's just a random thought that comes into my head. But the World Cup and the European Championships far more sanitised, if you like, far more ordered. Everything happens, it's timed. It's 3:02, the players enter the tunnel. It's 3:05, the players enter the pitch. Everything is ordered, regimented. It's done to a plan. The African nations was a bit more off the cuff, and all the more fun for it.
And obviously, you've done some absolutely massive interviews. You've spoken to Zidane, Henri, Capello, to name a few. Has there ever been an interview that you've been ridiculous? This can transcend across, sport, just in general, news as well. Has there ever been an interview you've been very, very nervous for?
Yeah, I think you're always on your toes when you interview, particularly the sort of intimidating characters like Sir Alex Ferguson. You don't know how he's going to react. So yeah, the bigger the name, I guess the more the sort of butterflies are there a little bit. But as the years go on, you kind of learn to sort of control that really, and just focus on what you've got to do, which is essentially get some usable answers out of them that can be used on the telly. Which is, it's not rocket science. You want to know what he thinks about the game, any controversies that are in the game, the context of where this leaves his team, good and bad performance. They're human the same as you are. I'm sure none of them are intimidated by me in the way that I might be intimidated by by them. But it's a conversation between two people at the end of the day. And okay, they're in a particular frame of mind. Even if they've won, they might particularly fire off at you and turn the tables on you. So you've got to be on your toes, really. You've got to use your experience and your training and your and whatever knowledge you've picked up to cope and deal the best you can.
Were there any sort of standout difficult interviews that you've sort of done during your career?
It's probably the Pep Guardiola one a few years ago when he was in a really foul mood because he was been unhappy about some refereeing decisions in a game, and he just didn't want to answer the questions. And I had to sort of persist at sort of asking the questions and covering the issues that arose out of the game, if you like. And it was just very difficult. Became a bit of a sort of news story for a day or two. Picked up by a few of the newspapers and even mentioned on Radio 4. I remember hearing it on the Today programme, which seems a bit bizarre. I think punters like to see a bit of argy in an interview. I think it's entertaining. It's all part of the cut and thrust of the game. Not everybody liked it. Some people said I was sort of fancied myself a bit for standing up to him. Other people said, he was at fault. So, you put it out there and people draw their own conclusions, really.
And I guess a bit of a final question, Damian. If you could go back in your career and relive one moment, what moment would that be?
Oh, no, that's a difficult one, really. I suppose in a sense, you sort of look back and think, well, maybe at the time I didn't appreciate it as much as I should, because it became a kind of a routine to go and interview these big names. And at the time, I never thought I was losing sight of how sort of special this is and how privileged a position I am. But maybe I should have appreciated it a little bit more, because it becomes a job and it's day in, day out. You're on sort of a bandwagon, really, of just doing what it is you do for a living. So, but then I guess I did appreciate it. I don't know. I mean, one moment it would have to be Dean Windass scoring at Wembley and getting my team into the Prem. That is the day that I'll take to my grave, I think. But other one-off, I mean, sometimes it's not the big occasions that stick in your mind that you think are fantastic. And I may have told you this story away from this interview. I went to see Sam, a team in Hamburg, who are the local rivals of Hamburg, SV Hamburg, the big team. And they're an absolutely unique club. And there are quite a few British football fans who know about them now and go and watch them just for the experience. They play in a sort of rundown part of Hamburg. They're very much the second team in Hamburg, a bit like, say, off the top of my head, Bristol Rovers to Bristol City, or I hesitate to say Everton to Liverpool, but you know what I mean. They are the second club. They're not the club that everybody knows outside of Hamburg. And it's a unique experience because their fans are all punk rockers, anarchists, and people who are on the fringes of the mainstream, shall we say, who started life as squatters in the rundown part of town and adopted the football. So they all turn up in black leather. They're all, as I say, they're a bit kind of on the fringes. They're not the kind of person that you'd want your daughter necessarily to come home with. But they're not hooligans. They're actually they're quite right on. They're into they're anti-homophobic. They're anti-racist. They encourage women to come to the game. They're quite sort of liberal-minded, but also a bit aggressive and a bit frightening. And going to see a game at St. Pauli is one of the great memories of my career. They played Hamburg in a local derby. Van Nistelrooy was playing for Hamburg. He'd finished at United. And the atmosphere was extraordinary. Half of the ground was kind of run down from the 1960s. Half of it was new. And there was a real... When the team came out, it got you in the guts. They came out to an AC/DC track, Hell's Bells. And the manager wasn't in a tracksuit or a normal suit and tie. He was in double denim. And he had tattoos and stuff. And it wasn't like any football experience you'd ever come across. And they were losing 1-0, equalised late on, and the place just exploded. It was just It was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had at a football ground. So, you know, for all the World Cups and the Cup finals and the, you know, even Dean Windass scoring at Wembley, that was an absolutely unique experience that I'll never forget.